Good day.
Today is Tuesday, 24th June 2025. As you can see, there is still internet connection problems in my home and in my surrounding area. The latest information, by the way, that I've received is that I will not be able to have full internet from my service provider until Friday. I'm not going to discuss the ins and outs of that. All I will say is that I'm very grateful to various people who've come up with various suggestions about how to deal with the problem. I have, in fact, already started to take certain steps. I'm in touch with Starlink, or at least one of the installers of Starlink, and I expect to have a full Starlink terminal very shortly. And again, thanks to everybody who suggested it. Though, as I said, I'm acting on that suggestion. But anyway, given that again I'm trespassing on the space of one of my friends, I think the best thing to do is to go straight into the topic of the programs. And today's program must begin with the announcement late yesterday and early this morning of a ceasefire, as it has been called. Perhaps a cessation of hostilities would be a more accurate description between Israel and Iran. Though I also ought to say that as of the time of making this program, the fragility of this consensus, and I think it's more a consensus than actually an agreement to cease fighting. The fragility of this consensus to stop launching missiles and airstrikes by each party against the other is being demonstrated by the fact that Israel is claiming that after the cessation of hostilities was supposed to take effect, Iran launched 2 more missiles at Israel, and the Israeli Defense Minister, Mr. Katz, is saying that Israel is going to attack Tehran again in retaliation for this supposed breach of the cessation of hostilities agreement. So we don't yet know that this is going to stick, but I am going to venture a guess that we might actually be coming to the end of this particular episode in this long affair. The affair being the attempt by Israel, the Israeli government, and certain people, important people in the United States and in Europe, to engineer regime change in Iran. Because that, to my mind, is clearly the objective here. Now, the first indication that was received that there was a final end point to this latest operation actually came several days ago when reports began to circulate that Israel was running short of air defense interceptors, that it perhaps had no more than 12 days left of the key Arrow interceptors, which are used to destroy incoming Iranian missiles. And there were certain statements from Prime Minister Netanyahu himself, I believe, saying that Israel was coming close to the point where it had achieved its objectives and therefore would want to stop the strikes on Iran. And then over the weekend, there were reports that Israeli officials had contacted the United States after President Trump seemed to announce a 2-week cessation, a 2-week delay before an American strike on Iran took place, and that the Israeli officials urgently told the Americans that Israel could not wait for 2 weeks. They didn't explain why, or at least the reports didn't say why, but it was fairly obvious that the reason, as I discussed in a recent program, was because Israel was running out of air defense missiles, and Israel was therefore anxious to get the American strike in before Israel visibly ran out of air defense missiles. It needed the United States on board with the air campaign before it became obvious that Israel's own ability to prosecute the campaign, the air campaign, was becoming exhausted. Anyway, that was one report that appeared over the weekend. And then yesterday, there was a further report that was published, I believe, in the Wall Street Journal, which said that Israel was seeking to contact Iran through intermediaries and was telling Iran that Israel had achieved its objectives in its attacks on Iran, that it was looking to find some way to end the attacks on Iran, that if Iran also stopped attacking Israel, Israel would also do so. And this seemed to be a proposal that was coming from the Israelis to Iran to bring the fighting, the missile launches by each side against the other to a stop. So we were starting to get reports which were beginning to crystallize yesterday in the Wall Street Journal that the Israelis, for, as I said, fairly clear reasons, were seeking to end the military part of the conflict. The United States had intervened, but as we will see shortly, over the course of yesterday, it began to become clear that despite statements from the US President Donald Trump suggesting that he was on board for the regime change agenda, the United States was again shifting away from a long-term commitment to such an agenda, from a protracted war against Iran, leaving Israel in effect on its own, and Israel doesn't have the means to prosecute a long war against Iran, and was therefore starting to look for a way out. Now, here I think it would be helpful if we went through the various statements that the US President Donald Trump made, and we can get a sense over the course of yesterday of the president's growing alarm and the factors that caused him to shift policy away from the regime change, protracted war policy, towards one where he started to indicate that he wanted to see the fighting ceased. So firstly, he published this comment on Truce Social. Everyone keep oil prices down. I'm watching. You're playing right into the hands of the enemy. Don't do it. The enemy, of course, clearly was Iran. And what was clearly unnerving the president at that point was that oil prices were starting to rise as rumours that Iran was preparing to close the Straits of Hormuz was starting to circulate. Then, shortly after that comment on Truth Social, the president published a further comment to the Department of Energy: drill, baby, drill. And I mean now in capitals and with exclamation marks following. How the United States could increase oil production so quickly in the event that the Straits of Hormuz were closed. Clearly the president wasn't explaining, but anyway, that was what he was saying. He was clearly becoming increasingly unnerved by signs that Iran might close the Straits of Hormuz, causing oil prices to rise, and he was becoming concerned about the effect of that on domestic inflation in the United States. He was largely elected in light of the cost of living crisis in the United States that was experienced by many Americans during the period of the Biden administration. He is aware of the connection between oil prices and the cost of living, and he was beginning to become alarmed that with signs that Iran was moving to shut the Straits of Hormuz, the situation might lead to oil prices rising much, much higher, causing the cost of living in the United States to rise also. And the fact that the president was becoming increasingly concerned, he then followed with another Truth Social post: get this bum out of office ASAP. The bum in question being none other than Representative Thomas Massie of Kentucky. He'd already published aggressive comments the previous day saying that he wanted Tom Massie to cease to be a congressperson. He published that further comment directly after he made the comments about oil prices. Of course, Representative Massie is a strong critic of the attack on Iran. That was why the president was so furious with him yesterday. You can see further why the president was becoming increasingly alarmed at the way in which increases in the cost of living could potentially vindicate Representative Massie's statements, criticisms. And then again, very shortly after, 2 hours later, a very interesting comment showing that the president was starting to get worried about the discussions that were taking place between Iran and Russia. I discussed yesterday in my program at some length the meeting between the Iranian Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi and President Putin of Russia, about how the Russians were saying that they might be prepared to provide Iran with air defense systems. This was alluded to by Putin's spokesman, Dmitry Peskov. I spoke about the pending possibility of a superpower confrontation. And, the president himself, Donald Trump, showing signs that the signals from Moscow were beginning to concern him, he published this comment. Did I hear former President Medvedev from Russia casually throwing around the N-word nuclear and saying that he and other countries would supply nuclear warheads to Iran? Did he really say that? No, he didn't. Was it just a figment of my imagination? If he did say that, and if confirmed, please let me know immediately, the word immediately, in capitals. The N-word should not be treated so casually. I guess that's why Putin's the boss. By the way, if anyone thinks our hardware was great over the weekend, far and away the strongest and best equipment we have, 20 years advanced over the pack, is our nuclear submarines. They are the most powerful and lethal weapons ever built, and just launched the 30 Tomahawks. All 30 hit their mark perfectly. So in addition to our great fighter pilots, thank you to the captain and crew. Well, Medvedev responded to that message very coolly and very calmly. He said, no, that Russia is not interested in supplying nuclear weapons to Iran. It's absolutely not going to do that. Medvedev pointedly said that Russia strictly abides by its obligations under the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. The implication is that others, the United States perhaps, are not doing so. So again, you can see that the president was clearly alarmed by the signals from Russia. He was perhaps also alarmed by Medvedev's comments about third parties, other countries potentially supplying nuclear weapons to Iran. As I've said in my previous program, I suspect that the country that Medvedev was alluding to is North Korea, and that is a real possibility. Anyway, whatever. the President, Donald Trump, was starting to become concerned about the statements from Russia. And then shortly after, just 2 hours after that comment about Russia, we have an extraordinary statement from the President, arguing against all of those who are now saying that maybe the missile and bomb strikes on the Iranian facilities were not quite as effective as the President has claimed or appears to believe, that Fodor in particular appears to have survived. That seems to have upset, those comments appear to have upset and enraged the President considerably, though they do, to stress again, reflect increasing expert opinion, though we are far from being in a situation where we can definitely say this. He then came up with an extraordinary comment. The sites that we hit in Iran were totally destroyed and everyone knows it. Only the fake news would say anything different in order to try and demean as much as possible. And even they say they were pretty well destroyed, working especially hard on this falsehood. And then there's a cascade of various journalists who supposedly were making those comments about the fact that maybe the Iranian sites were not completely destroyed. And then after that, the final statement, the final indicator that the President definitely was looking for a way out. Now, what happened over the course of yesterday is that Iran did launch strikes on US bases in the Middle East, in various Gulf states, particularly the massive US base in Qatar. Now, these strikes took place after the meeting between Arakshi and Putin, and the Iranians were careful to inform all of the relevant Gulf states, Qatar, the United Arab Emirates, and Kuwait, that these missile strikes would take place sometime before they did take place. The result was that the Americans, of course, also were informed about the strikes. The United States had already taken the precaution of evacuating all of its aircraft and most of its personnel from these bases at the time when Iran launched the strikes on those bases. As the Iranians well knew, the Americans would have departed the scene. So Trump seized on the fact that the Iranians conducted a token strike against largely empty American bases in the Middle East in response to the attack on their nuclear facilities. I've no doubt that the Iranians were strongly advised to do this, by the way, by China and Russia. Anyway, the president responded with relief, and he seized on that in order to make it clear that he wanted to bring the affair, the conflict, the military conflict between Iran and Israel to an end. Iran has officially responded to our obliteration of their nuclear facilities with a very weak response, which we expected and have very effectively countered. There have been 14 missiles fired, 13 were knocked down, and 1 was set free because it was headed in a non-threatening direction. I am pleased to report that no Americans were harmed and hardly any damage was done, which suggests, by the way, that some damage was done, but never mind. Hopefully, most importantly, they've gotten it all out of their system, and there will hopefully be no further hate. I want to thank Iran for giving us early notice, which made it possible for no lives to be lost and nobody to be injured. Perhaps Iran can now proceed to peace and harmony in the region, and I will enthusiastically encourage Israel to do the same. Thank you for your attention to this matter, And then, just to make it quite clear who is writing this, the post finishes was Donald J. Trump, President of the United States of America. And then, shortly after, we had confirmation that from Trump that a ceasefire had supposedly been agreed. So you could see the build-up to the announcement, increasing alarm from the President of the United States. He's worried about potential closure of the Straits of Hormuz, worried about the rise in oil prices, concerned, as the attacks on Representative Thomas Massie show, about the growing criticism in the United States. Incidentally, on that point, there was an excoriating statement yesterday from Marjorie Taylor Greene, in which she made absolutely clear her deep anger at the way in which the president appeared to have gone against his assurances that he would not lead the United States into another war in the Middle East. Marjorie Taylor Greene talked about her fears for her children, 3 adult children, I should make clear, and she made her criticisms extremely clear. So the president clearly beginning to become alarmed about the fracturing of his base, starting to become alarmed, as he should, about the signals coming from Russia, and the president expressing relief that the Iranians pulled their punches in their attacks against the American bases, and seizing on that fact to press for an end to hostilities. And what appears to have happened is that Trump told the Israelis to stop. This is before the Iranians had responded in any way to the signals from Israel, that they should stop and that Israel wanted to stop. But Trump telling the Israelis to stop, conveying the message through Qatar to Iran that the Israelis were going to stop, telling the Iranians to reciprocate. The Iranian position throughout all of these missile exchanges, going all the way back to the first ones that were launched on Friday the 13th, some say late in the evening on Thursday the 12th of June. I'm not keeping an exact timetable. But anyway, the Iranians consistently saying that they would stop striking at Israel when Israel stopped its strikes. The Iranians told that Israel was about to stop its strikes. They apparently kept everybody in suspense for a little while, but then they came back and confirmed that they would not, in fact, strike at Israel if and when it became clear that Israel would stop its strikes. Then a time was agreed for the strikes to end, and the president has come out and said, as he always does, by the way, and he is a politician, and one shouldn't be too critical towards him for this. The president has come out and said that all of this amounts to a ceasefire which he mediated and brokered, which, as I said, is definitely gilding the lily, saying more than perhaps actually happened. But anyway, we could see the lead up to this announcement and the way it came about. Now, prior to that deadline, that time for the ending of hostilities, both Israel and Iran continued to pound each other. It could be that the Iranians did launch 2 missiles at Israel after the timeline ended. They denied categorically, by the way, but it might be that they did, I don't know. The Israelis definitely wanting to hit back at Iran. I suspect that what we're looking at here is that perennial desire that you often find in situations of this kind, on the part of people to appear to have the last word. So it's important to each side, certainly to the Israelis, who, after all, initiated this whole thing, to appear to land the last blow. And anyway, we will see whether or not this does end now. But I am, on balance, of the view that despite the fact that we are likely to get a further Israeli attack over the next few hours and potentially a further Iranian attack on Israel, most probably it will end because the President of the United States wants it to end. He doesn't want to get drawn into another forever war in Iran, against Iran, in the Middle East. He started to realize the enormous dangers to him and the costs of doing so, higher oil prices, major problems in the economy in the United States, the peeling away of his electoral base, a potential confrontation with the Russians. And I think all of that will be enough in the end for him to get the Israelis to back off, and the Iranians ultimately, and in the end, will probably follow through on what they've always said, that they will stop their attacks on Israel if the Israelis stop attacking them, because the Russians and the Chinese will tell them to. And besides, I suspect that there are a lot of people in Iran who also, for other reasons, want this thing to end. Now, I am not absolutely sure that it will end, and I think this is a further point to make. If the Iranians respond to whatever attack Israel launches over the next couple of hours, then this could drag on, and the risk is that the Israelis will then tell Trump that it's the Iranians who are to blame for the fact that the hostilities are continuing, and they will press Trump to resume the bombing, American bombing of Iran, in which case all of the things that I was concerned about and was discussing in my program yesterday, and which we've also discussed at length on the Duran, will play out. We could find ourselves indeed in a protracted war of attrition between Israel and the United States on the one side and Iran on the other. The Russians and the Chinese might indeed, over time, become involved. The Straits of Hormuz might indeed close. We could see spikes in oil prices and all of those things. But on balance, I think the president, as I said, has started to see that this is not working out at all in the way that he expected. A further sign that the president is indeed looking to de-escalate the conflict, to bring it to an end, is that there are the reports that the United States has contacted China to try to persuade China to dissuade Iran from closing the Straits of Hormuz are apparently true. So the US does indeed appear to be very worried, very concerned indeed about that possibility. So anyway, there we are. That is the situation that we have today. Now, I am going to make the assumption at this point in the program that we are indeed going to see a cessation of hostilities over the next couple of hours. Let me stress again, this is all far from certain. It could be that this whole thing will break down, that missile exchanges between Israel and Iran will continue and even escalate, and that the Israelis will indeed persuade the president to commit the United States to a further bombing campaign against Iran, in which case, as I said, this whole thing could spiral out of control all over again. But, but let's just at least hypothesize and suppose that this cessation of hostilities sticks. Who has come out best from this affair? Well, I'm going to suggest that no one has come out entirely well from this affair. The Israelis, for example, have been able to demonstrate that they are indeed able to strike at Tehran. So far as I'm aware, they have lost no aircraft. I completely discount earlier Iranian claims that they'd shot down Israeli F-35s and F-16s and had captured Israeli pilots. The Iranians have never convincingly produced those people. They never provided us with pictures of aircraft wreckage. So it looks as if the Israelis have demonstrated conclusively that Iran's vaunted air defenses are indeed fragmented and ultimately ineffective. The Israelis have also demonstrated that Iran's internal security systems and its internal communication systems are massively deficient. The Israelis have been able to penetrate Iran with cells. They've been able to carry out sabotage. They've been able to carry out assassinations of Iranian officials. They've been able to track them and murder top generals and scientists and all of those things. And Iran's vulnerabilities have been cruelly exposed. But it must also be said that this affair has also demonstrated Iran's overall resilience and some of its strengths. First, and most important of all, the Iranian political system, the regime if you prefer, the government has withstood the blow. If you go back to what we were initially saying on the Duran, if you track what has been said by Israeli officials, including Prime Minister Netanyahu, if you go back and track what neocons of various descriptions in the United States and in Britain have been saying, including in their commentaries, there is absolutely no doubt at all, none whatsoever, that their objective was not to stop Iran acquiring nuclear weapons. The best way to do that, to be clear, was by supporting the negotiations that were already underway and by enabling those negotiations to succeed. The objective was to carry out regime change in Iran, to cause the political system in Iran to collapse. This is barely concealed anymore. Well, despite taking some savage blows, the political system in Iran did not collapse. The military officers who were killed were all immediately replaced. The people who took over were able to organize Iran's counterstrikes against Israel. There was an almost seamless replacement of commanders. And the overall impression is of a political system and of a government that continues to be stable and which retains its hold and support within the country. So at that level, at that most important and critical level, Iran withstood the blow. It also, however, demonstrated other points of strength as well. Firstly, despite various claims by Israeli officials, again, it tends to be forgotten that in the first hours after the initial Israeli strikes, the Israeli officials were openly saying that the worst outcome had been avoided, which is of an immediate Iranian counterstrike against Israel, that the Iranians had suffered too many losses of missiles and launchers to be able to conduct an immediate counterstrike in force against Israel. Well, those claims were made. As I said, probably they will be forgotten fairly quickly, but they were out there. The reality was that very shortly after those claims were being made, Iran did carry out a missile strike against Israel. It involved large numbers of missiles, and some of these missiles, a proportion of these missiles, a significant number of these missiles did get through and did inflict actual damage on Israeli targets. And in the weeks, days that followed, the Iranians were able to keep up a steady fire of missiles against Iran. The Israelis continued to strike at Iran. They continued to launch strikes on Tehran. They continued to launch strikes against the Iranian missile launching facilities, most of which appear to be underground silos, just to say. But they were never able to stop Iran from continuing to launch missiles that were able to get through and hit targets in Israel. Now, this is something that some people have difficulty acknowledging, but it has been openly discussed in the media in the West. The British media has covered it extensively. Even media outlets like the Daily Telegraph and the Financial Times, which are sympathetic to Israel, certainly in the case of the Daily Telegraph, less so in the case of the Financial Times. But even media outlets like those have acknowledged the fact, and in the case of the Daily Telegraph, they have expressed alarm and dismay about it. Now, that has demonstrated that Israel's air defense system, whilst not entirely ineffective, has nonetheless severe gaps in its coverage. The Iron Dome, David's Sling, the Arrow system have proved a lot less effective than they were claimed or expected to be. And not only have they proved to be far less effective, but their lack of depth has been exposed. As I've discussed earlier in the program, it became clear that Israel had only a small stockpile of air defense interceptors, whilst Prime Minister Netanyahu himself acknowledged that Iran has up to 22,000 missiles it can launch against Israel in continued storage. Just saying. So, if Iran's air defense system basically failed, its offensive missile strike capability against Israel proved to be effective. And whilst Israel also showed that it could strike and hit targets in Iran, it became clear over the course of the days that it could not repel all of the missiles that Iran was launching at it, and that in a long war of attrition, the advantage would indeed start to tilt more and more in favor of Iran. So Iran demonstrated resilience and it demonstrated strength. Its political system survived the blow. In fact, many believe that it has emerged strengthened, that there's been a rallying effect across Iranian society, that Iranians, even those who are critical of the political system in many respects have come together in defense of Iran. Iranians I know in London, who almost without exception, by the way, are deeply critical of the political system in Iran, are a case in point. Without any exceptions at all of them that I know of have reacted very, very negatively to the Israeli attack on Iran. There's been an article today in The Guardian by Nazanin Zaghari-Ratcliffe, an opponent of the Iranian government, of the Iranian political system. She was held for a long time in Evin prison. She's also got a British passport, and eventually the British were able to negotiate her release. Israel attacked the gates of the Evin prison. One might have expected an opponent of the Iranian system and a former prisoner who was held in that prison to welcome the attack on that prison. On the contrary, she is dismayed about it and has made her strong disapproval of what Israel has been doing absolutely clear. Well, that is one individual, and of course I can't speak for everybody in Iran or across Iranian society or in the Iranian diaspora. But I think that her response is typical. And I think also the attempt by some people in Israel and perhaps the United States to trot out the son of the former Shah and the person who claims that he should be Shah of Iran today and present him to the Iranian people as the right person to take over in Iran after the fall of the regime. I think that has gone down extremely badly with the overwhelming majority of Iranians. And whoever had that idea, whoever assumed that this individual speaks for Iranians or has any traction in Iranian society, has demonstrated their complete lack of understanding, their complete misunderstanding of the dynamics currently inside Iran. So anyway, there's been this rallying effect. The Iranian offensive capability has been demonstrated. But there's been something else too, and that is that, of course, this whole issue started supposedly in connection with the uranium enrichment program. There are grounds to criticize Iran for its enrichment program. There's been many people who have made the point that Iran enriching uranium to a level of 60% makes no sense in terms of Iran's own protestations that it is not seeking to acquire a nuclear weapon. Now again, this is controversial with some people. People say, well, Iran is perfectly entitled under the nuclear non-proliferation treaty to enrich uranium to a level of 60%. What it is not entitled to do is to weaponize the uranium it has so enriched. That is an entirely fair point, and it is one which has been made within Iran itself. It's not, I think, appreciated enough by some people outside Iran how controversial this policy, one could call it that, has been in Iran itself. Last autumn, as I've discussed in several programs now, I remember a whole procession of senior Iranian officials, including the now assassinated former head of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, General Salami, to all intents and purposes saying that the Supreme Leader's policy of allowing uranium to be enriched to the level of 60%, but not moving forward and weaponizing it, made absolutely no sense at all. But anyway, Put that all aside. That was the argument. The argument that was made, the justification, the rationalization for the strikes that took place over the last week, even though I have no doubt, as I've said, that the real purpose was to achieve regime change. After all, negotiations to resolve this issue over Iran's nuclear enrichment program were underway, and the Iranians themselves had indicated that those negotiations were going well. Anyway, the whole justification, the whole rationale was to destroy the uranium enrichment facilities and to bring its enrichment program to a complete stop. Well, it now looks as if that has not been achieved also. Now, yesterday I said that the emerging opinion of the expert community was that the American airstrikes on the Iranian facilities at Fordow, Natanz, and Esfahan had not destroyed these sites, that Fordow in particular had probably survived the worst of the attack. That consensus has gradually hardened, has further hardened over the last 24 hours, as far as I can see. But there is also now the worry, which appears to be not just a worry, but a firm belief amongst most people that the Iranian claims that they removed their enriched uranium from these facilities, that the reports that the Iranians had done that were true, that they did successfully evacuate their personnel, the enriched uranium, and some of their technical equipment, including some of their most modern centrifuges, and that they're in secret locations across Iran. It looks as if those reports were true. And of course, Iran has now said that it is no longer going to cooperate with the International Atomic Energy Agency, which means that the entire Iranian nuclear program, as I discussed in my program yesterday, has now become invisible. Whereas before the American strikes, the Americans knew where the enriched uranium was. They knew or had a good idea of the extent of Iran's capabilities and of its progress. One cannot say that any longer. From this moment, at least as of this moment, everything has gone dark. Now, I've set it all out here. I've set out the pluses and the minuses. The Israelis have demonstrated that they can penetrate Iran with agents and spies, that they can strike targets inside Iran. Iran has been deeply embarrassed, and it has taken severe blows. But it has emerged intact. The regime, if you want to call it that, has survived. Its ability to strike at Israel has been demonstrated, and it has not only preserved its nuclear program, but it has done so in a way that would now enable it to cast darkness over it, making it much more difficult for the Americans and the Israelis and the Western powers to have any insight from this moment on as to what exactly it is that the Iranians are doing. The Iranians always said that if Israel stopped attacking them, they would stop attacking Israel. As of this time, they have made no concessions at all. If this ceasefire does stick, then it is a ceasefire that mirrors the terms, the exact terms that the Iranians said they would agree to right when this whole operation began. And even the British media, even the Daily Telegraph, are admitting that the proposals for the ceasefire did not come from Iran, they came from Israel and from the United States. So I have to say this, if you put it in this way, then it's clear to me that Iran has come out clearly ahead on points. Now, as I said, I know there will be some people who will take issue with this. They will insist that the strikes on Fordow were completely successful, that Iran has been shaken. As of now, I cannot myself see, on the basis of the information that we have, that this is true. Iran has withstood the blow. It has struck Israel repeatedly. It has preserved, or so it seems, its enrichment capability and its ability to move forward with a nuclear weapons program, if that really is its intention. So it looks to me as if, based on what we know, this whole operation has been ill-starred and has failed. Moreover, the President of the United States has now been shown that there is a severe price for conducting attacks against Iran. A cost which he doesn't appear to have properly assessed or calculated on when he agreed to the strikes last week, or perhaps over the weekend. It seems that Iran does have the ability to close the Straits of Hormuz. If the Straits of Hormuz are indeed closed, then that will have an effect on the global economy and on the inflation situation in the United States. And it does seem that Iran, in a protracted war, could call upon the help and rely upon help from China and Russia. So it seems to me that Iran has definitely come out ahead decisively on points from this affair. If you go to some of the commentary that appears, especially in the British media today, because of the internet difficulties, I'm having some problems keeping up with all of the commentary in the United States. I get the sense that those people in Britain who were expecting that this would all end in regime change in Iran are not just disappointed, they are actually furious. They are very, very angry that this has all ended up so far short of what they clearly understood was the objective. Well, where do we go from here? Firstly, it needs to be understood that an enormous amount of damage has been done. Now, Alex Christoforou and I did a live stream earlier today on the Duran, and if you go and follow it, you will see that Alex, over the course of that live stream, outlined many of the red lines that have been crossed by Israel and the United States in the actions that they have taken over the last couple of days. Red lines not just in relation to Iran, but in relation to international law and the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. It seems to me that the whole policy of nuclear non-proliferation, the whole regime of nuclear non-proliferation that was painstakingly put together in the late 1960s is at best now in intensive care. As many people are saying, Professor John Mearsheimer is one of them, for example, Iran has now been given a lesson in why it might be wise for it to go further, pull out completely from the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, follow the example of North Korea, and weaponize its enriched uranium and actually provide itself with a nuclear weapons capability. Now, if Iran does that, there will be immediate repercussions. In the case of North Korea, it was just about possible to limit the damage to the nuclear non-proliferation regime because other countries in the Asia-Pacific region did not follow North Korea's example. Neither South Korea nor Japan moved forward to acquire nuclear weapons themselves. In the Middle East, it is certain to be different. If Iran acquires nuclear weapons, as night follows day, Saudi Arabia and Turkey will do so also. There is a high possibility, a real probability, that Egypt will then follow too. And bear in mind, if we're talking about Egypt, Egypt politically appears to be a very unstable country. Al-Sisi's government at the moment is able to maintain control, but we can never be sure for how long. So if all of these countries start to acquire nuclear weapons one after the other, who seriously expects that other countries around the world are not going to start to follow suit? Already, we've seen India, Pakistan, North Korea acquire nuclear weapons since the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty was signed. If a whole cluster of other important Middle East states start doing the same thing, then, as I said, to all intents and purposes, the entire system of nuclear non-proliferation, painstakingly created since the 1960s, is dead. It is ended. We will see the spread of nuclear weapons and nuclear weapons technology around the world. And given that we're talking about a technology that was mastered in the 1940s based on scientific breakthroughs that took place in the 1920s and 1930s, there is no technical obstacle to other countries acquiring this capability. The only limitation is the supply of uranium ore, and like every other commodity, if the demand for it exists, so eventually will the supply. Now, some people will say, well, this is all inevitable. It's probably not the worst possible outcome. It might even stabilize things in some way. I don't myself accept that view. I find the whole development incredibly alarming, given the realities of the modern world. My own view is that if nuclear weapons spread, it is almost a certainty that they will be used, and if they are used, a taboo will have gone, and then they will start to be used more and more, with all of the enormous dangers and risks that follow from that. So, I consider that these events of the last week have been a disaster. I think that they have been a disaster for humanity and for the world. I do earnestly hope that we can find a way back, that this ceasefire does eventually hold, and that we can get some kind of negotiations concerning Iran's nuclear enrichment program back on track, and that Iran will finally do that which the Russians offered it last year, which is seek a defense agreement with the Russians, and that the Russians will then follow up with that by providing Iran not just with new weapon systems, Sukhoi 35 fighter jets, S-400 anti-aircraft and anti-missile missiles and all that kind of thing, but that they will indeed move forward and provide Iran with that integrated air defense system, probably integrated with Russia's own mighty air defense system, and that will be the way in which we stabilize the situation in the Middle East. I am not by any means confident that will happen. I am sure that there will be voices in Iran who will say that Iran would be foolish to place all its reliance upon the Russians. After all, it was only about 10 years ago that the Russians were supporting sanctions against Iran, and that the Russians, during the time of Dmitry Medvedev's presidency, walked back an actual signed contract that Russia had made to supply S-300 missiles to Iran. So there will be many Iranians who will say, including Iranians at the highest levels, that Russia cannot be completely trusted in this situation, that Iran must secure its own protection by going down the nuclear weapons route. I very much fear that those voices will prevail. I hope they don't, but it does seem to me that probability, that possibility, is now a very, very real one. And lastly, one has to say this: the regime change agenda that some people in the West have, and which the Israeli government has with respect to Iran, has not gone away. It is likely, one would assume, that the activation of the cells inside Iran, the assassination squads and people of that kind, the intelligence operatives that have been embedded within the Iranian system, that the events of the last week have to some extent exposed the various networks that the Israelis have planted inside Iran, and that they have perhaps been crippled. But given the ineffective, even chaotic quality of Iran's internal security systems, unfortunately, one cannot be certain of this. And it's quite likely, even assuming that the military offensive that we have seen against Iran really is called off, that we will see a campaign of assassination and subversion within Iran continue and intensify over the next couple of years. All of this intended ultimately to lead to regime change inside the country. Now, on this topic, Conor Gallagher has written an exceptional piece on naked capitalism, about the kind of campaign of subversion that might be conducted against Iran. Its title is Proxy Fighters in the Fog of War. It discusses how Iran itself is a very complex society made up of many different, I'm going to say, linguistic groups rather than ethnicities, because my sense is that most of the people who make up these groups, even if they talk different languages, Turkish and Kurdish as opposed to Farsi, nonetheless do define themselves as Iranians. Iran is a country with an ancient and storied history. And as I said, all of these linguistic groups do appear to owe allegiance to the nation and state of Iran, of which they all seem to feel themselves a part. But nonetheless, there is this patchwork of different linguistic groups. And as Conor Gallagher correctly says, It's exactly the kind of material that Western intelligence agencies intent on creating internal destabilization and regime change like to work with. And despite what I said about the fact that the overall loyalty of these groups has always historically been to Iran as a nation, well, things can change, ideas can be planted, rivalries can be created. We are dealing with intelligence agencies that have long experience in exactly this sort of thing, and we cannot in any way discount the risks that they will try to do that and that they will achieve some success in doing it. And of course, the Iranians are unlikely to simply sit back and let this happen. My own sense is that one of the reasons why Iran's internal security systems have been so defective is that for a long time, the Iranian leadership has been focusing more of its efforts in its external intelligence operations in Iraq and Lebanon and Syria. It's established large networks of its own there. It could start to activate them. There's been a covert shadow war going on between Israel and Iran, well, probably for decades now. It is likely that that could intensify massively going forward. And anybody looking at the situation in the Middle East today can see how dangerous all of that can be. So my total view of this is, yes, Iran has indeed come out ahead on points, decisively ahead on points. But the damage done to the international system, to stability in the Middle East, to the cause of nuclear non-proliferation has been profound, and we're going to live with the consequences of that for many years ahead. So that's my overall assessment of the situation today. As I said, it could be, even as I'm making the program, that the Israelis are, well, they probably will be attacking Iran. It could be that the Iranians will conduct counterstrikes against Israel. The Russians will probably advise them not to, but the Iranians, as we've seen, have the ability to make their own decisions. The President of the United States, despite having clearly second thoughts about this matter, and by the way, just to make this clear, all credit to him for doing so. The fact that he does sometimes seem to know when to stop is something we should be grateful for, despite the confusing way in which he gets to that point. But anyway, the president, despite his obvious doubts, perhaps might be persuaded, if missile strikes between Iran and Israel resume, to rejoin the Israeli campaign and to try to seek regime change in Iran. That would be a disaster, but perhaps that is what he is going to do over the next couple of hours and days. We shall see. We all need to be keeping careful watch on Truce Social and worrying about what he says there. But anyway, there we are. That's a real possibility. But assuming, as I said, that ultimately we do get to the end of the missile strikes by one side against the other, this will be a very uneasy peace. Yes, Iran has demonstrated its resilience and its strength. It's come out ahead on points, but this is hardly the end of the affair, and the damage that has been done in the meantime has been profound. Well, basically, this is where I'm going to end today's program. There's an awful lot else going on in the world, of course. The Russians continue to make significant gains in the conflict in Ukraine. The Ukrainians appear to be preparing to launch some kind of missile against Russia, against Russian targets. Zelensky's chief of staff, Andrei Yermak, is making all kinds of threats again against the Russians and telling the Ukrainian people that whatever their feelings about Zelensky, he's there to stay and they just have to live with the fact. I've already said that, in my opinion, the major priority for the Zelensky government now is not even to win the war, but to retain control. Incidentally, there are reports appearing in the American media that the American government, senior people within the American government, have now become as exasperated by Yermak as they are by Zelensky himself. They found him every bit as treacherous and as impossible to deal with as they have found Zelensky. Just saying. Meanwhile, as I said, there's been reports about a Ukrainian counterattack in the Sumy area. There's a good description of this counterattack and its lack of success in Redovka. Redovka says that 3 battalions, around 1,500 men, are involved in total, that the Russians are having no difficulty repelling this attack, and Redovka says that the ultimate outcome of the attack will be to weaken Ukrainian defenses in Sumy region and to facilitate the Russian advance on the city of Sumy once this attack has been defeated. Group of Forces North, by the way, is basically saying the same thing. For the record, I believe that this attack, this counterattack, has been insisted upon by Zelensky himself. He was goaded to do it by certain comments by the dissident MP Mariana Bezuglaya, talking about the collapse of the defences in Sumy region. Zelensky had a meeting with Syrskyi and with the other military chiefs, and I get the sense that he ordered this counterattack to take place, basically to allay the concerns expressed by Bezuglaya's comments, and I suspect that's all there is to it. I doubt that this is a serious offensive intended to lead to anything anymore. But there's been quite a lot of information about the situation around Pokrovsk in particular, and I suspect that over the next couple of days we will see important developments on those fronts too. But this is not going to be a program about the situation in Ukraine. I've set out what I believe about the situation in the Middle East between Israel and Iran. We will see whether this so-called ceasefire sticks. And even if it does, to repeat again, this is far from being the end of the affair. Well, thank you again for joining me today. Let me remind you again, you can find again all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X. You can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar, links under this video. Don't forget, you can also check out our shop where we're continuing to do our promotion on various things that you can find, like magic mugs and other things that are city related. Last but not least, if you've liked this program, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.